As I said, I hope everybody's at least somewhat rested and refreshed with the break, and we've all recovered from snow in April yesterday. There's something just fundamentally wrong with that concept, in my humble opinion, but anyway. So we are going to dive right in and move on to the final unit of primary sources. So as you may remember, you're going to have to bear with me without my stand here. I might be a little bit awkward. So back to our sources of the law chart in terms of exploring primary sources. So we have explored the legislative branch. We have finished up exploring the judicial branch. And now we move on finally to the executive branch, and sometimes referred to as administrative law. Did everybody take or about to take administrative law? So we will be referring a little bit to that. And as you can see on our chart, we are primarily going to be speaking about regulations, but there are other aspects of administrative law that we will be discussing as well. But first, just a brief kind of refresher about exactly what the executive branch consists of. And what one of your handouts is this chart here, which is, I'm sure you can't see on the screen. I can't see that on the screen. I can barely, actually I can't even see it on my laptop. So hopefully seeing it up close and personal helps a little bit. So this actually is the entire government, but you can see the executive branch is laid out. So there's the offices within the president, and we'll be talking about presidential materials and documents in next class. But then below that, we see the various agencies, and of course they're different. They're cabinet level agencies and they're independent agencies. We don't really have to worry about those differences, but it is primarily the product of those agencies that we will talk about today. So the first product of those agencies, which we'll be spending most of our time on, is, as we saw again in the sources handout, those regulations. And as you discussed, I'm guessing at length in administrative law, you discussed the delegated authority, how Congress essentially tells the agencies, hey, agencies, we're delegating our constitutional authority to make law to you, the experts in your particular areas. So in looking at our chart, if we pick out, say, the EPA, Congress might say, hey, EPA, you're the experts. You figure out how many parts per billion it's safe to have arsenic in our water or whatever comes out in the air. You've got the expertise, so you figure that out, and we have the Clean Water Act, we have passed the Clean Air Act, you figure out the details on how to implement those acts. And that essentially is delegated authority. And as I imagine, this is very much a simplified review of what you discussed in your administrative law classes. So that's essentially why these agencies exist on this chart here, is to deal with that delegated authority. In part, these articles that I duplicated for you, I think, are an interesting application in the real world of how this works. So you can see this top article, Attorneys General say EPA exceeding authority. It was very recent, just a couple of months ago. Apparently, a number of states' attorney generals are suing the EPA for violating federal law. You can see the little aspects I've underlined, basically for exceeding their statutory authority. So again, this is this concept of delegated authority. Congress says to the EPA, okay, please implement the Clean Air Act, implement the Clean Water Act. Actually, this suit is about the Clean Water Act. And the state's attorneys general are saying, hey, wait a minute, EPA, whatever you're doing, you've exceeded that authority that Congress has delegated to you under the Clean Water Act. If you turn the page on this particular handout, you'll see more specifically they're suggesting that the head of the EPA basically went beyond the definition within a particular definition within the Clean Water Act. So you can see that this delegation of authority has very real consequences. We'll be going back and forth between a couple of our handouts today. So if you pull out our walkthrough, I think on pages 1, really page 2, is a great sort of picture of this concept of delegated authority. So page 1 is just the explanation of what we're looking at in the Code of Federal Regulations, and we'll be talking about the Code of Federal Regulations in depth in just a few minutes. But looking at page 2, basically what you see, as it says up top, is the table of statutory authority. So what this is telling us is for all of these regulations, which wind up in the CFR, and again we'll talk about the CFR in just a couple of minutes, what is the authority for all of these regulations? And you see this table and the transference, I think, fairly clearly. So in the right-hand column, we've got the CFR section, and in the left-hand column, we've got the United States Code, the statutory authority. So in looking at Title 29 of the U.S. Code on page 2 of the walkthrough, we notice one of the sections we've been talking about throughout the semester, section 1132, the authority to make regulations under that section is delegated, and they wound up in parts 25, 60, 70, and 71 in the CFR. So again, just that concept of statutory authority delegating to the agency, and in those news articles we see how important it is to respect and understand exactly what that authority is, because otherwise there are actually a number of lawsuits that go on with a number of the agencies in terms of whether or not they have acted within their authority, whether they've exceeded their authority, whether they have executed the authority, in other words, whether or not they've done what the statute told them they had to do. So another example of that, back to the articles handout here, turning to the next article, Supreme Court EPA can regulate greenhouse gas. So this is from a few years ago, back in 2004, and another lawsuit against the EPA. And again, this is real world. I'm not making this up. At that point, at that time, the EPA had plans to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and there was a lawsuit suggesting that they were exceeding their authority, that there was no authority within the Clean Air Act to do this. And the Supreme Court ultimately weighed in, so the case worked its way through the courts. And as you can see, the results of that Supreme Court decision in 2014, where it was sort of, they gave a win and a loss to the EPA in terms of whether or not the EPA stayed within its authority, as you can read in the details here. But they did so they upheld part of what the EPA did, and they struck down part of what the EPA did. And if you turn to the last page, that was a reference, as I just mentioned, to a case that was brought, again, against the EPA. What the EPA does is gets litigated, in which the EPA was sued because it was felt they weren't doing the what Congress basically told the EPA they needed to do with regard to producing regulations under the Clean Air Act. So again, this whole concept of delegated authority and the concept of how important it is to understand the authority for these regulations. Regulations can get struck down, as we see in this example. So as you are dealing with these regulations, and as you're dealing with issues for clients and litigation, that is something you want to keep in mind. Okay, any questions? So another aspect of what these agencies do, in addition to issuing regulations, is, as you probably talked about again in administrative law, is there are also what are known as administrative law judge. It's called a quasi-judicial function. I'm don't know if you discussed that in your administrative law class, but basically as part of these different agencies, there are these administrative law judges who will sit and hear disputes, basically controversies about people who are saying that the regulation shouldn't apply to them, or whatever the dispute is with regard to the agency, and these administrative law judges will actually issue decisions. Now, these are not court decisions, they're administrative law judge decisions, but they are looked to as the agency's interpretation of their regulations, because it's their administrative law judge interpreting their regulations. So this is another source of administrative law, and we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. One thing we will talk about, also talk about next class, is state administrative law, but pretty much what we are talking about today with regard to federal will apply very, very similarly to the states. So it will be what some folks like to call wash, rinse, repeat. So we'll review the states next time. Questions? So a real-life application of this comes to us via one of my favorite sources, and that is, assuming the link comes up, back to Jon Stewart of The Daily Show. Now, as you'll see in this video clip, this is somewhat dated. This refers back, I think at this point, probably at least 10 years to when the Dodd-Frank Act was first enacted, but the concepts that they talk about actually still are relevant today. And it's kind of interesting, too, now, because a lot of those regulations that finally did get issued under the Dodd-Frank are now being reconsidered. So let's take a look and see what Jon Stewart has to say. Okay, we're not getting sound. Bear with me. Why is that not stopping? Hang on. Okay, super. Okay, it's too bad. It's a fun one. It has John Oliver in it as well, so it's one of my favorites. So we will try again. I am determined. But in the meanwhile, okay, so before we go into the details about getting to know the CFR and the sources, let's talk a little bit about how to find regulations. Because regulations are very, very specific, we've talked about controlled vocabulary with regard to statutes. As you can imagine, as these agencies talk about the very specifics of how to implement these laws, they can get very detailed. So we're talking about specific chemicals or other very defined terminology, which means keyword searching is going to be a whole lot more difficult. So consequently, the ways of finding primary law that we've talked about, such as, should be review. What are good ways to find primary law? Secondary sources. That's going to be really important. Actually, believe it or not, I keep on calling it our BFF, our best friend, the annotated code, actually going to be really useful as well. So here, for instance, on our least favorite friend, Bloomberg, if you scroll, so we're looking at that section 1132. If you scroll down, at the bottom there are references to the Code of Federal Regulations. So here we see Part 729, Part 2570, and Part 2560. Notice they're different parts. I'm going to explain what part exactly means in just a few minutes. But in, again, talking about finding regulations here on Lexis. So again, here's our annotated code. Again, same section, 1132. And on Lexis, hopefully not surprisingly, you will find them in research references, right? I hope that makes some amount of sense. You'll notice a reference to the CFR. Now, the one thing I'll mention about the annotated code, you won't always necessarily find references to the CFR for every single U.S. Code section. And in addition, sometimes the references you get in the annotated code are not on point for what you need. But you will need to be looking in the annotated code almost certainly if you're dealing in a regulatory issue, because a statute will apply. So it's worth taking the extra, as you can see, just a couple of seconds to check. And again, here on Westlaw, we have the same references in context and analysis. So one key to finding regulations, and this is really true, whoops, that's not where I wanted to go. This is really true with regard to the regulations, is finding the right part. Now, the part is basically an overall subject area within the CFR. So if we take one of these references, I'm looking here in Lexis, so these are some of the references. So let's take a look at just this first one here. It sounds like it could be relevant, Employee Benefits Security Administration. So that gets me to a particular part. And one key, and this is probably more true in the CFR than any other resource we've talked about, one key is using that table of contents, using the hierarchy of the area, the subject area that we're in, and taking a look and seeing what other sections are there. So for example, we just clicked on that reference from the U.S. Code. So here is this section, requests for enforcement pursuant to this particular 502b2. And we are looking at 29 CFR 2560, so that's the part, and then here's the section 502-1. So the whole section number is referred to as 29 CFR 2560.502-1, as you can see. So 502-1 is within part 2560, so you can see that here. So you might want to look at the table of contents for part 2560. But really what you want to do, and this is we saw this also when we looked at statutes, this technique, sort of working our way up the hierarchy to see what's still relevant to us. So definitely rules and regulations for administration enforcement might be relevant. Administration enforcement under ERISA, we know ERISA is important to us, so that's still relevant to us. So we might want to actually go even higher up in the hierarchy. And we might even want to go one more step to Employee Benefits Security Administration, because they're probably the folks that administer the ERISA, right? Employee benefits. So hopefully this is somewhat common sense. You have to give it a little bit of thought. And I say we want to go up to that point because if we go up one more, regulations relating to labor, that starts to get pretty general. Far more general. Think about it. There are a lot of different areas of labor law that have nothing to do with what we're interested on. There's discrimination in all sorts of other areas. So this link is probably the highest link to go to. It might be easier. I mean, you can go through that analysis working your way up the hierarchy if that makes sense to you. Or if you prefer, I actually like this better myself, I like to go to just click on the full table of contents. So I can see what are the different levels, and I can work my way up. So here's part 2560, and I can work one step up to this administration and enforcement, and then finally to chapter 25, employee benefits. One reason I like to do this is I can see rather than just clicking and looking and clicking and looking, I can just see it in one screen, the entire layout within this chapter of the different subchapters. So look at this, subchapter B, definitions. I always want to look at definitions. So I'm definitely, no probably about it, going to look at part 2510 and the sections within 2510 that look like they might be relevant to me. and I'm just going to go through each subchapter and see, does that seem like that's going to be relevant for our client? And then even scrolling past on the later parts, because that's still within the same relevant chapter. Are these other parts likely to be relevant? So here I see one way down here, group health plans. We know that our issue has been coming under that heading quite a lot in some of the other reading we did, remember, back in secondary sources and in the statutes. So we will want to check out subchapter L, and it turns out part 2590 as well. So I cannot emphasize enough how important the table of contents is for the CFR. More often than not, when I am looking for regulations, I will get a part reference from somewhere, a secondary source, maybe a keyword search, maybe the annotated code. And honestly, the initial reference I might get, wherever it's from, might not be relevant, but if I take the part reference that sounds the most relevant, as long as it sounds somewhat relevant, and I look at the table of contents, that usually will get me, that's how I usually find what I need to find with regard to regulations. And again, we're looking at federal regulations, but this same strategy absolutely applies to state regulations as well. Any questions? So one thing I also wanted to point out with regard to finding regulations is we talked I just mentioned doing keyword search. That, as I suggested, can be difficult to succeed with because the terminology is so specialized, but sometimes that's the way you have to go. So looking here on Lexis, I've done our favorite search, liability HMO, and what you want to know on Lexis and Westlaw, and I'll show you Bloomberg as well, is the different categories. So as we discussed, there are different types of administrative resources. So here, Lexis gives us administrative codes and regulations, and up here, administrative materials. Now, I've chosen administrative codes. Again, you want to be doing your research in the code, just like the U.S. code and your state codes. That's where the current regulations will be in a subject arrangement. And as we see, I'll just flip back to sources. And we see, again, the Code of Federal Regulations is exactly that, a subject compilation, where you will find the regulations that are in force. So back here on Lexis, again, we've chosen administrative codes, but what Lexis requires us to do, because notice we're seeing an FR, and that's the Federal Register. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's not the CFR. What Lexis requires us to do, and this confuses a lot of people, is if we want to look at the actual code, which we do, we need to further narrow to go to administrative codes. And I don't know why that's not available, so let's...
It's been acting up a little bit.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Okay, so you'll get to see me go through administrative codes. And again, if this doesn't work, I wonder if that's the source of our earlier problem, but no matter. Well, you'll have to take my word for it. See if I don't have a tab. One reason to have tabs up at the ready. Okay. Westlaw looks a little bit different. Again, you'll notice I've done our liability HMO, and Westlaw has regulations, and then it has administrative decisions and guidance. So you find the CFR, you'll find the codified regulations under regulations in Westlaw. And again, when we talk about administrative decisions a little bit later on today, that's where we would go on Westlaw. And then finally on Bloomberg, we have the content type, and again, we want to go to codified regulations. And then again, if we obviously want to narrow by jurisdiction, if we're only interested in federal.
How was the click-through from the home screen? You started on, like, clicking through, you started on regulation, and then just went
Well, so I'm,
federal and, like, the click. So you've already done a keyword search. If I wanted to just click through from the home page,
you mean on Bloomberg?
I mean, on any of the services, equivalent to, like, using the key number system in the beginning just to, like, look at a topic and just keep clicking and clicking and clicking. If you went to just the home screen on any of them, you go to regulation or administrative materials or regulations.
So I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. So essentially, in other words, if you wanted to go there before you search?
On Lexis, yeah, on Lexis or Westlaw.
Okay, let's do Westlaw because Lexis seems to not be happy at the moment.
Regulations.
So you can either go regulations if you want all jurisdiction, or you can narrow by jurisdiction.
Right, that's what I'm at. It's just, do you think this would be a time-efficient way of seeing everything and just narrowing down what you think is relevant, or no?
I think that when you are doing research involving regulations, you probably also want to see other types of material. Now, obviously, each circumstance is different. I tend to not want to narrow immediately because you never know when you run into something accidentally that's very useful. But if you know, you really just, someone tells you there's a regulation out there, go find it, then yeah, you want to go this way because why deal with the other stuff? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So one thing that not being able to get where I want to go has not let me shown you, so I'll try to do it a different way here, is we saw in the references within the U.S. Code a couple of different parts. We saw 29 CFR Part 2560. We saw a reference to 2570. That's yet another reason you need, and I emphasize need to look at the table of contents because very frequently the relevant regulations will be in several different parts. And again, here on Westlaw, you can see the hierarchy looks a little bit different, but the strategy of going to the table of contents looks the same. And again, you want to work your way up to determine where to check or just take a look at the entire table of contents. Questions? If you take a look at our walkthrough, there also is an index to the CFR. This is rather hit or miss, but sometimes if you're having difficulty coming up with the terminology to even search, to do a keyword search and you're not getting references in secondary sources or annotated codes, this may be the way to go. The index is available on Lexis and Westlaw. Just again, go in the title bar and type in CFR index. But just so you can see it, you can see what it looks like on pages 3 and 4. Again, you would have to know to start under Employee Retirement Income Security, which is always the challenge of using an index in terms of where to start. And then looking on page 4, again, you would need to know to look under. It actually refers you to pensions on page 3, so you'd know to look under pensions, and then within pensions you could find employee retirement, and you could see at least the listing for group health plans. And again, another key, we haven't read through the secondary sources and all of the background material, but by this point you would want to be familiar enough with your area to understand the different terminologies that's used, so you'd want to hopefully by this point understand that group health plans is in fact relevant to our issue, as well as some of the other parts listing that we saw within the table of contents. Okay. So let's get to understand what the CFR does and what it tells us, because I think that will help you understand how to research it, as well as just be bibliographically aware, as we always want to do. So as I pointed out a couple of minutes ago, back here in the sources handout, so I've already mentioned the CFR, of course, is the codification, so it's the subject compilation. But the regulations follow the same pattern that we saw with the statutes, in that the regulations, what the agencies issue that become part of the law, initially are published in a chronological, not a subject-oriented publication called the Federal Register. So again, we have chronological publication where it first appears, and then it gets codified, it gets put into subject arrangement, where it's also will tell us what's currently in force, because obviously regulations change over time, just like statutes do. And that's the Code of Federal Regulations. The Federal Code of Federal Regulations, as we will see in a few minutes, is updated every, well, the print publication is updated every year. And we'll go into updating in more detail because it's not quite as straightforward as that. But the Federal Register actually comes out every single day. Well, every single business day. But let's get to understand the CFR a little bit better. And to do that, I was hoping to go back to Lexis. Let's see if Lexis will cooperate. So we went to the table of contents of Lexis, so we still have it up. And it's a code, it's codified, it's subject arranged, and just like the U.S. Code, the statutes, those subjects are referred to as titles in the CFR. That's true in a lot of state regulations too, but possibly not all. So one thing you want to keep in mind, though, is that the titles in the CFR do not always respond to the titles in the U.S. Code. Sometimes they do, though. So, for instance, Title 26 is Internal Revenue in the CFR. It's tax in the U.S. Code. Likewise, Title 29 we saw was labor in the U.S. Code. It's labor in the CFR. However, there are other titles that do not correspond. So Title III, the President, and Title II, Grants and Administration, General Provisions, is not Title I of the U.S. Code, I don't think. So just the point of this is just don't assume that the same title of the U.S. Code will apply to the CFR. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. So that's pretty basic. And as we've already seen, each title in the CFR is subdivided either into subtitles and then into chapters, and then finally into parts. Let's take a look at our walkthrough handout and turn to page 5, which didn't get numbered, so it's obviously the one after 4. And let's take a look at what the CFR looks like up close, and as we'll see, it's pretty much the same online as well. So we've already talked about the table of contents, turning to page 6, which there is a number. And as I've said, it's very incredibly necessary to look at the table of contents and work your way up. So we've determined that Chapter XXV 25, Employee Benefits Security Administration, is relevant to us. And so within the table of contents of Chapter 25, you will see on page 7. And again, we've seen this. This is what we're looking at basically now on Lexis. But now you can actually read it, what the different parts are within the different subchapters. So you're seeing the different part numbers. So kind of mentioned this already, 25, 10, 20. So you can determine which of these will be useful to check. So as we've discussed, the definition part we definitely want to take a look at. possibly 2550, rules and regulations for fiduciary responsibility, because we talked about whether or not that might be an avenue to pursue for our client. We've discovered 2560, rules and regulations for administration and enforcement. So we got those references, 2570. And if we hadn't already discovered it, turning the page to page 8, looking at the table of contents, again, whether in print or more likely online, we would discover chapter 2590 under group health plans. That might be useful as well. So turning to page 9 to investigate further what this actually looks like. So let's take a look at 2510. We already decided definitions are a good idea to look at, and so again, you see what it looks like in print. We've seen what the table of contents for each part looks like online. So we then see the actual section number itself, and I've already gone over this, but it's worth reviewing just to make sure you understand, because people do tend to get a little bit confused about some of these numbers get pretty long sometimes. So again, within Title 29 of the CFR, we're looking at Part 2510 on page 9, and now we're looking at the table of contents. So we see the section number, 2510 3-1, 3-2, and we see the name of each section, so the actual section that contains the text of the regulation. So we see the definition for employee welfare benefit plan and employee pension benefit plan, so we can then figure out from the table of contents which sections we want to check out. And again, very important, just below the table of contents in print, and again I'll show you online in just a few minutes, we see the authority. So what the CFR is telling us, we don't have to go searching out some random table somewhere. Within the table of contents, and sometimes within each section, we will see the authority. Where in the USC did it authorize this regulation to get promulgated? Again, very important because the agency has to stay within its statutory authority. So we see that various sections of the USC were the authority for Part 2510. And it goes into some detail. And then we finally, at long last, see our sections, the text of the regulation. So here's 2510.3-1, and you see the text of the section there. So everybody good with the numbering system? I know it sounds like I'm belaboring something fairly basic, but it does cause confusion now and again. Okay, that's the case. Let's move on to page 10. So now we're looking at a more involved part. By more involved, I mean there are just more sections under it. So we're looking at that part 2590, the rules and regulations for group health plans. And again, we see the table of contents in the left-hand column, the different subparts and the different sections, the actual sections. So we might want to scan to determine which section we might want to take a look at and which sections we don't have to worry about. And we will discover, and again, another reason why the table of contents is so wonderful, is that if we hadn't found it through all of our keyword or secondary source or annotated code references, we will see on the right-hand side, there's actually a regulation section discussing preemption, and that's 2590.731 on the right-hand side. Everybody see that? So again, another reason why the table of contents can be so useful is you can discover sections that probably are very relevant that you might not find otherwise. And again, after the table of contents, we see the authority. Again, that's the statutory authority within the U.S. Code that allows this particular agency, in this case the Department of Labor, to issue and promulgate these regulations. Okay. Now, just below the authority, you'll notice something labeled the source. I have a handy-dandy arrow there, and the source is telling us where in the Federal Register this regulation was initially published. Remember, we have that same pattern where it initially was published in the Federal Register and then got transferred over and codified into the CFR. And so what it's telling us is that this part 2590, was in this particular issue of the Federal Register, published on April 8th, 1997. Everybody following me? Unless otherwise noted. So what happened is this part was initially promulgated back in 1997, but there may be sections that were added to this part right after 1997. That was a long time ago. There may have been sections that got repealed. There probably were sections that were changed. So when that, unless otherwise noted, is just a key to you to pay attention to the section to see if there are any other Federal Register source references. And we'll talk about why you care about Federal Register source references in just a little bit. Okay, so we, again, after the source, the authority and the source, we finally see the beginning of the sections, the first section of Part 2590, so that's 2590 606-1. And then if we take a look at one of the sections that might be interesting that we would have identified in the table of contents, turning to page 11, so we're looking at 2590.715-2719. Like I said, these section numbers can get kind of funky and long. Yeah, Alex.
I'm going to go off topic, but as far as the Federal Register, is there notice for comments on that as well, or is it you have to go like to the respective agency to look up?
No, the Federal Register has the notice for comments. We'll be talking about that just a little while when we talk about the Federal Register, but absolutely. Going back to page 11. So looking at our section 2590.715-2719, internal claims and appeals and external review processes. So this is actually setting forth how our client might have or possibly should have, or how we may need to file an appeal for the denial of her coverage. And turning to page 12. It talks about minimum internal claims and appeal standards. So again, I'm just highlighting for you why these regulations are so important. And frequently the regulations are where you find the quote-unquote answer to the question you have for a particular client, because the regulations go into that level of detail. Now, of course, this is only one small part of the answer for our client. But it's one small part that we would definitely want to know about. And then finally, turning to page 13, we notice at the end of this section, 2590.715-2719, we see an additional FR reference. So again, the source in the Federal Register for this particular section wasn't back in 1997. It turns out the source for this section was 2015. So you just want to watch after the section for your particular source references. And finally, turning to page 14, we see subpart D. So we're jumping ahead a little in part 2590 to subpart D. And we see that section I highlighted for you regarding preemption, 2590.731. But above that, under the subpart D heading, we notice that subpart D apparently has its own source as well. And after section 2590.731, we see the sources for that particular section. So we see the sources 69 FR 78778, published on December 30, 2004. We are going to come back to this concept, so I would ask someone to write it down. Somebody have a pen? You already have paper. So somebody. Tessa, you're our scribe for the day? Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so let's take a look. So this is what the CFR looks like in print. more likely than not, you will be looking at it online, although you can find the CFR for free online, which we'll be looking at GovInfo, which we'll be looking at in a little while, and it looks exactly like this because basically it's just the PDF online. You also find it on Hein Online, but GovInfo is free, so that's always good to know about. Okay, so just so we can see, so there's 731 on Lexis. Thankfully, I already have it up. And couple of things you want to notice about Lexis. First, instead of having to find after each section, and this is true on Westlaw as well, as I'll show you in just a moment, Lexis spells out the statutory authority. So it lets us know this is actually the authority note applicable to the entire part, so all of Part 2590. And again, it gives us the USC references. And then it calls the source history. Why Lexis and Westlaw insist on changing the names of stuff we already understand from the original, I don't know. But hopefully it makes a little bit of sense because it's the history of the regulation, right? It's where it was in the Federal Register. So again, it started in April. It first was published in the Federal Register in April of '97 and then was changed a few times, including in December 2004. Okay, likewise on Westlaw, that's even the right section. So again, Westlaw, just like Lexis, insists on changing the names. So instead of history, it's credits, I guess, because Westlaw uses the term credits for the history of statutes. Remember, that's where we find our all-important public law or chapter numbers in the credits. So they call the Federal Register source credits. But thankfully, they at least use the same term, authority, for the USC statutory authority. Okay, any questions about source and authority, what they are, most importantly? Hopefully we understand why authority is important to know about. In case you need to find the statutory authority, we'll be talking about source in just a little bit. Okay, but before we do, unfortunately, the CFR is not a BFF. It is not an annotated code. So at least in print, and what we will see in GovInfo, it's just the text of the regulations. That's where our good friends Lexis and Westlaw and Bloomberg, as usual, to a lesser extent, come in. They kind of help us out with that in terms of providing us with references to interpretations of our regulations. Now, as I mentioned, there are actually several different ways that regulations get interpreted. First, like statutes, they get interpreted by the courts. So there are lots of court cases that discuss regulations. And not surprisingly, we will find those here on Westlaw in citing references. Actually, it looks like there aren't any for this particular section. If all goes well, somewhere or other, I have, let's see, if it's not in that section, I have one. Nope, okay, so. So I'm just pulling up a section where I happen to know that there are cases interpreting that particular section, but it's good actually to know that there are plenty of CFR sections where there aren't cases interpreting that particular section. And so here we see this one, claims procedure, also might be important for our client, and we notice that there are in fact notes of decision. So our BFF, our annotated code, even though it doesn't exist in print, Westlaw has made it an annotated code for us. So it gives us notes of decisions. Again, court decisions interpreting this particular regulation section. Just like notes of decisions interpret statutory sections, we have the equivalent here for the regulations, as well as citing references. Again, other references that just mention our particular section. So we can find cases that just, a whole lot more cases, not surprisingly, just mention this particular section than actually discuss it in the notes of decisions. And likewise, on Lexis, so here's a different section, but the concept applies, where we will find, no, I don't want to go there, I want to go there. Case notes. Just like we did for statutory sections, we will find a whole lot of cases that interpret this particular regulation section. In addition, just as we had citing references on Westlaw, which is essentially part of Keysight, we can actually shepherdize a regulation. And so we see the different cases. That do that. Any question about finding cases, court opinions that interpret our particular section? Okay. So, as I'm sure you're all just very excited and waiting for, what do we have to do? Update, update, and update. Absolutely. So, that gets, depending on which source you use, it may or may not be slightly more complicated. If you're lucky enough to have Lexis or Westlaw, and it won't be free access, but access that you don't have to worry about, then it is just very straightforward. So just pulling out a section of the CFR here on Westlaw, basically the only thing you need to keep track of is this is an effective date. So that was a couple of months ago. That depends on the agency determining way back when they promulgated the regulation, we're going to make this effective as of whatever date. They can make it the very next day after promulgation. They can have a delay of a month or two or a year. That's up to whatever the agency determines when it's promulgated the regulation. So effective date is very different than when your resource has been updated. When your resource has been updated, as always on Westlaw, currentness, and basically these regulations have adopted all the regulations that have become final regulations in the Federal Register through, as you can see, yesterday, right? That was yesterday. So Westlaw is pretty up to date. Again, don't get that confused with when this actual regulation was changed. It was last changed actually a little bit over a year ago. But our source has been updated on Westlaw through yesterday. That isn't always quite that recent. When I looked at this a couple of days ago, it was about 5 days old. But that's still pretty good, my humble opinion. Here on Lexis, make sure we're in the CFR. So Lexis isn't quite as up to date, but tomorrow it might be. So it's telling us just right up top. Current through March 28, 2018. So that's a week, give or take. And again, don't get that confused with when that particular regulation section was last changed by the agency. Because as you can see, this particular section, which is different than the other one we were looking at on Westlaw, was last changed a few years ago. So everybody good on updating on Lexis and Westlaw. You do want to make sure to shepherdize on Lexis and update and take a look at the citing references on Westlaw because, again, cases, court decisions can nullify a regulation, right? We just saw an instance where the Supreme Court upheld in part and nullified in part a particular regulation as finding that the agency exceeded its authority to some extent, but not completely. I used to show an example, but you can't find the regulation anymore, where the FDA had issued regulations regarding labeling on tobacco packages, on cigarettes basically. And initially, the courts found that the FDA exceeded its authority to do that, so the regulations were pulled. And if you had been looking at that regulation a month after the Supreme Court decision, you wouldn't know that unless you shepherdized or looked at the notes of decisions and citing references. Hopefully, Lexis and Westlaw would also include a flag to highlight that for you, but I'm not sure exactly how attuned they are to that. So that's also part of updating. So let's talk a little bit about finding the CFR and updating for free. Because if you're not fortunate enough to have access to it on Lexis and Westlaw or Bloomberg, you will want to go, as I mentioned, to GovInfo. GovInfo is now the website of record of the GPO, the Government Publishing Office. GovInfo is where we found a free version of the U.S. Code. So, not surprisingly, it's also where we will find free version of the CFR. And what you'll notice is that it lists the editions. So, yes, it might be you might need someday to find out what the regulation was back in 2013, or even last year, 2017. But there's one other reason, and this is what I alluded to earlier when I mentioned that updating can be a little more complex for the CFR. And the reason for that is, as you will see, so here in 2018, where we are now, you'll notice we start with Title I, not surprisingly, and it tells us Title I was updated January 1. So I'm scrolling through here, and of course, I know we want Channel 29. I want to take a look at our sections, our different parts that we identified. So I'm scrolling here in 2018, and I get to, wait, Title 16, Commercial Practices. Where's Title 29? Because the next link here is 2017. Essentially, what's happening here is, let's see if it tells us this. It actually tells you this up here. There are 4 different, the CFR is divided up into 4 segments. Each segment is updated at a different point during the year. So the first 16 titles are updated in January, titles 17 through 27 in April, 28 to 41 in July, and 42 to 50 in October. So after Title 16, the April version, the April updates haven't come out yet because, well, it's only April 2nd, right? Or 3rd, whatever. So that's why we don't see any titles beyond Title 16 in the 2018 version on GovInfo. We'd have to go to 2017 to get to see something from Title 29. However, so that's why I say if you're lucky enough to have Lexis or Westlaw, it's much easier because you just look at the section and it's at most, what, a week old. Not too bad. If you're not so lucky, then you can go to GovInfo, but it's not so terrible. You just need to understand, again, bibliographic awareness, you need to understand what you're looking at and that, all right, I need Title 29. That was last updated in July 2017. If there are any changes since then, I need to know about them. So the place you would go is called the eCFR, and you will see a picture of that on page 15. And in truth, if this were really user-friendly, they would give you a link here, but I don't see one. Let's see if it's in the Read More. No, it's not as user-friendly as I would like. I will actually suggest that to our government documents librarian to send it on because he communicates with the GPO. That they really should put a link to the eCFR somewhere right on that front page. Anyway, if you can remember eCFR, as you can see, the eCFR updated March 30. The page on your handout, obviously, I printed out a couple of days ago, so it's a little bit older. And then you can just navigate your way through. You can search here, or you can navigate your way through to whatever section it is that you may need. And so here in Title 29, I know I'm interested in Chapter 25. And if we scroll down to 2590, just because I remember it, we can see the different sections. And so there's our section on preemption. Now I'm going to go off topic a little bit just for a couple of minutes to our very first class, only because I nearly fell into a trap that we talked about in our very first class. Liking to do things quickly and easily, as we all do. I remember CFR, so I went into Google and I Googled eCFR. And I looked at Electronic Code Federal Regulations, eCFR. Oh, look, that's what I know. That's what I need, rather. And eCFR.io. I thought it was .gov, but maybe they changed. I haven't looked at it in a whole bunch of months. So if you look at page 615A, you will see this version of eCFR. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, they changed it. You know, government, everybody's changing websites all the time. They change the look and feel. This is nice and simple, just like Google. Everybody likes simple these days, myself included. So I honestly already had copied this page for our handout today, and I'm taking a look and just making sure everything looks the way it's supposed to. So as scrolling down to Title 29, like we just discussed, and oh, that looks about the same, and going to Chapter 25 and taking a look at the section with 2590, or rather Part 2590, and then going to our section that I wanted to talk about. And I'm thinking, whoa, advertisements on the government site? I don't remember seeing that before. Really? They're allowed to do that? And I'm thinking to myself, that's odd. And so I go back to some of the criteria we talked about, and it's like, .io. What on earth does .io mean? I mean, I'm familiar with .com and .gov and .edu. I know that I remember reading they expanded the domains because .com just got so overused. And so I investigated. Let's see, do I have that? No. Well, I thought I had that up here. Doesn't matter. So I took a look, and yes, I'm not going to rely and cite to Wikipedia, but it's going to give me some idea, or actually even the Google. What is the .io domain? The up-and-coming domain for tech websites, startups, is a trendy and fast-growing domain. So it turns out, I don't know who these people are. I don't know why they decided to republish this eCFR, but this is some commercial venture. And I think I even joked with you that back when we first started in our first class that, you know, those of us, I have very rudimentary ability to write web pages in HTML, but I could put up Lisa's Bar and Grill and website and just put up the US code and maybe change a few words here and there to not or take out a not, and obviously change the meaning entirely, and you need to be very careful. So you need to think about the reliability of the website. And sure enough, I nearly got caught in that trap because I was working too quickly. But thankfully, it finally clued me in, like the ads clued me in, and the .io started to make me question, wait a minute, what is this? So I definitely would not want to be relying on the CFR that's in .io. I have no idea. Maybe they are totally fine and they've reproduced it totally faithfully, but I just don't know. So there is a case in point where what we talked about way back in the beginning of the semester has come back to application and what we're looking at today. So make sure to go to ecfr.gov. Okay, back to our topic of administrative materials. So the ecfr.gov, so published by or produced by the GPO, is still the unofficial site for updating the CFR. The two official sites are on pages 16 and 17, and the official print site is called the LSA, the List of Sections Affected. You'll see that the online version on page 16. The LSA is a rather involved way to update the CFR because of this periodic update. Different parts of it are updated at different points during the year. Because we have the eCFR, I don't know that you'll ever have need for the LSA, and unlike legislative history, where I suggested some of you may never use it, although, Caitlin, right, you discovered you needed to use it, much to your chagrin.
Yeah.
I think this I might even be more accurate in, like, you probably won't ever need the LSA. I mention it, just maybe it'll stick somewhere in some corner of your memory. Should something come up where you need an official source, it actually does exist. So the LSA, you would check, as it says here, for changes to an existing section that you already know about. So if it's updated in July, you want to see has there been any changes since July. And on page 17, you would see the CFR parts affected. So that's a little bit different than the LSA. And that way you would be able to see what parts have been changed. So are there any new sections added to my part? So were there any new sections added to Part 2590 since July 2017? Again, with the eCFR, I'm not sure you'll ever need this, but I'm letting you know it exists. I'm not even going to, and I will say online, and if you wind up having to use the print, they do actually have pretty good instructions in online or in the publication itself if you wind up having to use it. Of course, you always ask a friendly reference librarian, and we'd be happy to help you as well. So any questions about the eCFR and updating? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Federal Register. I had put that off for a little while, and let's go back to it. So I told you, again, back to the first class, that I wasn't really going to go into much history or theory. I'm going to bend that just for a minute or two now, and you may or may not have heard this again in your administrative law class, but back sometime in the 30s, there was a case, part of the name was Panama Refining. It was referred to as the hot oil case. Does that ring a bell? Okay, so apparently, and I'm oversimplifying so you all can fill in the details and correct me if I get anything totally wrong. So apparently this case made it to the Supreme Court even though the regulation that it had been based upon had already been revoked before the cases were even filed. So it kind of made people realize, wait a minute, we need a single place where we can find the regulations that are currently in force, aka now currently known as the Code of Federal Regulations. So kind of in response to the hot oil case, the 1935 Federal Register Act was passed by Congress, and that required the publication of a bunch of different executive and administrative documents, including involved in rulemaking, including, Alex, the notice of rulemaking, proposed rules. So first the notice saying, hey, we're going to make a rule on this. Then the actual proposal that they say, the agency says, hey, here's our proposed rule. Then there's a whole notice and comment period. And again, you all who've taken administrative law far more recently than I have can go know all the details to all this. And so all of that now gets published in the Federal Register. And then again, the final, once it goes through this whole notice and comment period, then the agency comes out with its final rule. That then gets transferred and codified, again, put in subject arrangement in the CFR, in the Code of Federal Regulations. And of course, in addition to this Federal Register Act. You all discussed in detail the Administrative Procedure Act in terms of the right of the public to participate in this whole rulemaking process. So did I get anything wrong, administrative law people? Cool. Okay. So what you will find now in the Federal Register are presidential documents. Remember, we started, there are different types of administrative documents, so we'll talk about those next time. But you, as I said, you'll also find the notices, the proposed rules, the final rules. And what you will also see when a particular agency publishes a final rule is you will see a discussion of the comments. You will see background of why the rule came about. Does this ring a bell of something we discussed in the statutory realm? Caitlin? Legislative history. So this in the Federal Register, and why you now should care about the Federal Register is if you need to research the regulatory history. So if there is language in the CFR and you're saying, what did they mean by that? What was their purpose? What's the policy? You had to look up legislative history for policy, right?
Yeah, my boss wanted, like, from 1946, all of the policy related to one specific section, and I spent countless billable hours, which I'm sure is not going to be fun when they get the bill, but trying to find like what they meant when he was like, particularly one senator, what he meant when he was arguing for or against this one section in 1946.
And as I recall, there were your boss wanted to make policy arguments as well.
Some policy arguments, and needless to say, we didn't really find anything new. So I don't know, but it was not very fun at all.
Well, sorry about that, but that's unfortunately part of the profession. So that same need might arise with regard to CFR sections, and so that's why you do indeed have to care, although it's not very fun either.
It started out fun because it's like a scavenger hunt, but by like hour 14 it wasn't very fun.
Yeah, it tends to be the case with just about any project. The first couple hours are fun, it's new, it's interesting, and by hour 14 it's like enough already. So here is what the Federal Register looks like. And as I said, it comes out every business day, just about. I pulled out the latest print version that we have in the library, which actually isn't too old. It's from March 19th of this year. Pass that around. And I neglected, so I'll back up for just a moment. So here's an example of the CFR in print. And so here's our Title 29, and what you will see on the cover, which is of note, so take a look when it comes around. You'll see it was updated July 1, 2017. And again, this is Title 29, which actually says on the cover too. What I also have is Title 1, which, as you remember, is in the updated portion in the 2018 portion of the CFR, and that was last updated in January 2018. And you'll notice there are different colors. And every year the CFR changes its color. So if you are using it in print, you can be clued into the fact that you're looking at an older or a newer version because you'll see different colors on the shelves. Probably won't be using the CFR in print too much anymore, but it is color-coded. So regulatory history in the Federal Register. So let's take a look at page 18 of our walkthrough. And you'll notice we are looking at December 30, 2004. Tessa, what was the date you wrote down? Fair enough.
February 24th, 2014.
Oh, that's not the date. Well, the date I had. Okay, so that's okay. So if we take a quick look back at page 14, and look at the underlined source on the right-hand side, you will see December 30, 2004. So I was not clear enough. That was my error. Nope, you wrote the last date. I did not specify to write down the first date. Fair enough. Okay, so the point being, we are looking at that date of the Federal Register. So if you turn to page 19, within that date of the Federal Register, you will see, left-hand side, Department of Treasury, and then just below that, Department of Labor. And you will see 29 CFR Part 2590. And then you will see something called an RIN number. That's a useful number if you have to research this particular regulation. And if you go just a little bit below that, you will see action. Final regulation is actually a handy-dandy arrow for you there. So again, as I mentioned, the Federal Register contains a bunch of different types of documents. It contains presidential documents. It contains notices, as Alex mentioned. It contains proposed rules. It also contains the final regulation. The final regulation is what will go into the CFR and is what we need to research as part of our primary source law. You'll notice the next handy-dandy arrow tells us the effective date. As I mentioned, the agency can set the effective date for whenever it determines it makes sense. So this, back in December, end of December 2004, the effective date was made in just a couple of months later in 2005. The other thing the Federal Register does, which we don't get in the statutory realm, is they actually give us places we can call for help. For further information, contact. Now, granted, Dave Mlowski may not still be at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. He was there in 2004, apparently. 14 years later, it's kind of questionable. But you get a phone number you could try, and somewhere in there is a website in the next column for supplementary information. And I think there's another phone number in there as well. So the Federal Register can be kind of useful if you need help. Now, obviously, if you are calling the government and you're representing a client, you need to be very careful about what you tell this person you're talking about because you don't want to give away client confidences. But nonetheless, that information is there and can be useful. And then you get to the part that I have been talking about, the regulatory history. So we see background. And so we see essentially the agency's description as to what they're trying to do. And you can see on page 19 in the middle column, I underlined after consideration of all the comments received. So the agency went through this whole rulemaking process, starting with the notice and the proposal, and then they got comments from interested parties. And then they talk about what they did with the interim and then final rule. Sometimes the process I described is oversimplified. Sometimes agencies will issue interim rules before they issue the final rule, so it's sometimes a little more involved tracking down, but they will tell you clearly in the action what it is that they are doing. So back to our discussion of regulatory history. In the last column, we see the overview of the final regulation, so it starts to talk about what they're trying to do overall. You see the underlined portion. Final regulations do not modify significantly the interim rules. So there's an example where there were interim rules, but instead in several clarifications to the general framework already established. So you may need to trace back to those interim rules to see if the agency talks about anything they did or their justification for what they put in those interim rules. And turning to page 20, again, I've underlined just a little bit of language to talk about, to show you how the agency is describing why it did what it did. So a little bit of those policy arguments, possibly. And then finally on page 21, we actually see the section that we were looking at and the agency setting forth the actual text of the regulation section 2590.731. And you'll notice that's on page, at the top left, it's on page 78778. And back on page 14 of our walkthrough, you'll see that the first Federal Register site, December 30, so 69, so that's just the volume number, Federal Register, 78778. Everybody see that? So that's how I was able, so if I need to look at the regulatory history I look at the source of my section right after the section, and then I go find the Federal Register for that citation. That brings me to the actual text of where my section is set forth, but I can then go to prior pages to get some of these other aspects, other pieces of information that the Federal Register provides us. The policy, the supplementary information, phone number if I want. So that's how I would find regulatory history if I needed to. And page 22 just is the continuation of the text of the section. So any questions about the Federal Register, how the source tells us where in the Federal Register we need to go? You can find the Federal Register in Lexis and Westlaw. You can just plug in that citation. You can find it on GovInfo. If we go here to GovInfo, I tend to like to go to the category. And under regulatory information, that's where we find the CFR and the Federal Register. But more importantly, the concepts. You understand the difference between the FR and the CFR. It's easy to get them confused. Very different. Questions? Comments? Another place, actually, to find the Federal Register, in addition to GovInfo, and this is a free source, is regulations.gov. And Alex, if you are interested in tracing down comments of a proposed regulation or a recently promulgated regulation, this would be the place to go. This is relatively new, and it's kind of neat, I think, because it used to be if you wanted to look at the comments submitted for a particular regulation, you would have to go to Washington, D.C. to the agency's offices. Back when I was actually in law school and working for the summer, I actually did that. Talk about tedious. That it was. But here on regulations.gov, now that we are in the modern era, I could just have gone online to give you a sense of what's there. Again, these are going to be what agencies are currently considering. There are lots of different ways of using this site. We're not going to go into that level of detail, but I am going to show you a little bit of what it can do. So let's take a look at what's trending or what's trendy. And if any of you are interested in vaping, there's regulations talking about flavored tobaccos, tobacco products, which is involves vaping. So we can see some details about what kind of action it is. So this is an advance notice of a proposed rulemaking. It gives you a summary and some of that Federal Register. And we can actually open the docket. And we see some of the documents produced. So the proposed rule. And then this actually, comments are still being accepted, and here are actually comments submitted by people who have different views on the value of vaping.
Oh my God, they let them on online forums.
That is online, and to view them all, you get the full, and you can add your comments as well, for those of you who are interested.
Oh, that's ready for dictatorship or something.
Well, actually, the idea is quite the opposite.
I
To give
understand,
people
but the idea of people trolling on online forums on regulation.gov for advance notice of power blows my mind.
Well, I don't know. I suppose they obviously could be trolls, because there are trolls everywhere these days. But you have to know about this. The trolls have to know about this. So this particular rule, or actually notice of rule, I think on the prior page we saw had something like over 3,500 comments received thus far. So this is one of some interest. I'm sure there's some rules that have tens of thousands of comments. Because some of these regulations are obviously, I would think, for instance, bump stock devices. That's obviously something that's been in the news a lot, so might generate a lot of comments as well. And you can do some in-depth research on this site. Again, if you had that RIN, that regulation number, you could do that there as well. Okay, last before our workshop, and we are going to do a workshop, it's not all me talking today. I'm going to talk a little bit about administrative decisions and guidance. So as I said, we spent most of our time talking about regulations, but there are these interpretations by the agencies themselves, and they come in the form of decisions and guidance. And they're slightly different. The decisions, as I said, are administrative law judges who actually rule in a court-like setting about a particular controversy. So individual, a company, a group comes to the agency and says, you've misinterpreted this regulation. And so and I think the APA, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the APA establishes rules for how these proceedings work. Where you can find these decisions is kind of tricky, and always has been tricky. Actually, the web has made it much easier. Personally, I would not go to Lexis or Westlaw first because I find them rather hit or miss and not exactly well logically organized, at least to my mind. I prefer the web. So if you remember, or you just remember to search Administrative Decisions Guide, so this is just a research guide on administrative decisions put out by the University of Virginia, you will find a listing of the departments, and this is also on page 24 of your handout. And on page 25, and I'll scroll down here in just a moment, since hopefully by this point in your research you know you are dealing with the Department of Labor. And I can obviously get down here a variety of ways, and so here's the Labor Department, and it's just pretty much, so I might just looking at this decide the Employee Benefits Security Administration, and here are some of those decisions. What else might be of interest? So I've also highlighted the Benefits Review Board, so either one of those. And so let's see. Let's go to ERISA advisory opinions. So yeah, that's what I was afraid that would. So what you also need to be aware of, government websites change. Not only do they get spoofed like that .ecfr I told you, but they just plain old change. That tends to happen when there's a change in administration, especially if there's a change in party within the president's office. Each party wants to do things their way. That happened when President Obama took over from President Bush, and it's happening again now that President Trump has taken over from President Obama. So what used to be the Department of Labor site is getting revamped, and now looks like this, and the University of Virginia hasn't updated all its links quite yet. So the challenge with that is you have to, when you get used to it one way, then you have to go find everything you used to find on the old site. You have to figure out how to find it on the new site. But there are a number of ways of doing this. So for instance, you might remember, oops, I don't want to go there yet. And again, this talk of administrative law, we've gone back to the beginning of the course a couple of times, and we'll do it yet again. You might remember in searching a website, the advanced Google site search. And I might just want to search for my topic, preemption, or if I can't find the advisory opinions, or I might want to search for decisions. So let's see. Because honestly, I had a hard time finding the advisory opinions. So advisory opinions. Oh, see, that gets me to the old site. But anyway, the point here being, remember the site search if for whatever reason you're having difficulty, oops, or you're having difficulty, or you just want to do a term search. So that's one way of finding decisions. We already kind of talked about how to do it on Lexis or Westlaw, and by kind of. So here on Lexis, a couple of different ways. You can shepherdize the document. Now in this one, I'm not sure we'll find any. So what you'll see under citing decisions, you'll see whatever court cases there might be, which for this particular section there aren't any, but you also see agency materials. So that's where you would find it on Lexis, on Westlaw. Under citing references, you will see oops, I went too fast there. Under citing references, you would see administrative decisions and guidance. Now, as you can see, Lexis and Westlaw lump those two, the decisions and guidance, together. You really, even if you really want to check, if you know you're dealing with a particular agency, you really want to check separately for guidance. And that's what these last couple of tabs are about. So you will see, all I've done on Google is search Department of Labor guidance. Not too complex there. And sure enough, you get a pretty straightforward link up top. And here it points me to advisory opinions. And here's a labor guidance agenda. Now, you may or may not remember back in our first class, in our just regular Google search, when we did our issue spotting and we plugged in our search terms, one of the sites we came up that was kind of a little bit useful, it was actually kind of good to get us started because it introduced us to ERISA, was actually a Department of Labor guidance page. So again, the guidance from the Department of Labor is the Department of Labor telling people, lawyers, non-lawyers alike, this is how we are interpreting ERISA in this particular case. So while it isn't the law, it's the agency telling you how it's interpreting the law, as well as interpreting not just ERISA, the statute, but any of the regulations that it issues. So it's definitely somewhere between persuasive and authoritative. So the point being that you really want to find that guidance if it exists. So as you see, I Googled it here, and I then did our site search for the guidance page just to see if I can get it to the end so you can see. And I did a search for one of our search terms, preemption, just to see. So I'm actually getting references to a bunch of different advisory opinions. So again, these are the opinions issued in particular. Opinions issued by the Employee Benefit Security Administration to, in this case, an attorney, because he's ESQ, on a particular issue. So an opinion is going to be more specific on a particular issue. Guidance is just going to be overall, here's how we interpret this particular area of the law. And both can be very useful and important. In some areas of the law, the guidance is really what gets relied upon by attorneys practicing every day. Any questions? Okay, so we do have a workshop after. So I will pass this around, and while this is going around, I will talk a little bit about assignment 5. This is our last assignment. Everybody celebrate, yay! So I usually don't hand out the assignment before we're through the particular area, but because of the timing of the semester with spring break and everything, I I want to be able to get your assignment 5s back so I can grade them and get them back to you so you can use them to study for the exam. And so what you will, for those of you who like to do it early, and I know there are a couple, you, based on what we've discussed today and we'll go over in the workshop, you will be able to work through Part 2D. You'll want to hold off until after next week for Part E. The assignment's due in 2 weeks, so that should give you plenty of time. Part 2E and Part 3 are not very long, and even Part 3 you can start to think about. And you may want to do that because Part 3 basically is an overall question asking you to bring everything we've done all semester together and to come up with a strategy for research. And Part 3, a very similar question, will be on the final exam. And I'll be going over the final exam in great detail in 2 weeks. But Part 3 is essentially your chance to get a practice it on the assignment and get a chance for me to give you feedback, which is why I want to get the assignment, have you get the assignment to me so I can get it back to you so you get that feedback. And if that it confuses anybody, just let me know and I'll be happy to explain.